You grew up in rural Kenya, where energy access was limited. How do you think that influenced who you are today?
Seeing light showed me a lot of possibility.
How do you recognize when an opportunity is for you?
It's just taking the available opportunities, even when they look crazy and risky.
You made history as the first Black woman to lead Schneider Electric East Africa. What was the most challenging part?
I was building power plants across Africa, and my mother, still in the same village that I grew up in, still had no power.
Do you ever worry that the decisions that we make as a continent, as leaders, if we don't get it right, it becomes a real burden to the continent?
Sometimes they say, when you put light, you're shedding light on the poverty. But I think we need to, because only then do we really get to solve the real challenges. If you look at Africa, Africa has been just around about 600 million people for the last 20 years without electricity. So what is wrong with Africa?
Welcome to Doers Defined, where we amplify emerging market heroes bringing positive change. Today, on this episode, we're joined by a powerhouse of purpose and impact, Carol Koech, currently serving as the principal for sustainability in Africa at Schneider Electric and based in the UAE. Carol is no stranger to trailblazing. She made history as the first Black woman to lead Schneider Electric East Africa as CEO and country director, with over 20 years of experience spanning engineering, finance, and commercial leadership at global giants like Unilever and General Electric. Carol has been at the forefront of driving access to energy, innovation, and inclusive growth across the African continent. But her influence goes beyond the boardroom. Carol is a fierce advocate for gender equity in STEM, a dedicated mentor to the next generation of women leaders, and a global voice on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Recognized among CIOs Africa's most influential women to watch, Carol Koech is the kind of leader who doesn't just dream of change, she does the work to create it. Carol, it's such an honor to have you on Doers Defined today.
Thank you very much.
So I always say, let's dive in. So I think people get to know Carol. What 3 adjectives would you use to describe yourself?
I consider myself as a dreamer, an executor, as well as an enabler.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. And I think your resume also shows the same. So I want us to talk a little bit about your formative years. You grew up in rural Kenya, where energy access was limited. How do you think that influenced who you are today?
I remember the early days growing up. And because that's all I knew, I didn't know that there was a place with light. I actually remember in primary school going for preps in the evening, and the only source of light we had was a pressure lamp, which was an upgrade from our normal kerosene lamp at home. And only when I went to high school did I actually realize that there was a better light, which was electricity. And that, over the years remained as one of the things that I would like to solve, because I know there are many other children and people that are going through the same background that I did when I was growing up. And just seeing light showed me a lot of possibility. And so that became my mission. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's wonderful to hear just how much your childhood influences the things
Yeah.
that you decide to solve later on in life.
Yeah.
And electrification and energy access has been really at the core and the heart of a lot of what you have done.
Yeah.
So I think with that, I wanted to go a little bit into your journey, because I would say you're one of those leaders that is very impactful but quiet. And so I think my question to you is, in a world that often measures success loudly, how do you define quiet impact?
When I described myself as an enabler, it really means exactly that, enabling others to shine. And I consider it almost removing boulders on the way so that others can walk. And, sometimes we could shout at the top of our voices, but there's no results. Or we could get stuff done, and the people that see the results are the ones that truly feel the impact. And for me, that I think is where I see, being able to make some influence in a quiet manner. Yeah.
So your career path, it defies convention. An engineer by training who's thrived in auditing, in finance, in sales, and now executive leadership. Carol, how do you recognize when an opportunity is for you?
It's very difficult to answer that question because there's a lot of serendipity in how my career has evolved. Just to walk you a little bit how, I've made those career choices. I think one of the things that stands out from my life, generally, that's how I live, is just taking the available opportunities, even when they look crazy and risky. I've made some moves that could be considered suicidal from a career perspective. Got out of engineering school, and I had this internship at Safaricom, and I was sitting in the they call it NMC, which was like the National Monitoring Center for the network. Then Safaricom was very early days. And we were watching all these sites and, coordinating with the team in the field to go check maintenance. So 2 months in, and I'd been interviewing at all these different places. And then KPMG came calling, and I was like, oh, okay, this is off my training, but hey, let's try it because this is a job I have at the moment. So I took the role. And then 6 months into the role, I had been interviewing all along as well. And Unilever came calling, and I was like, maybe this is a better deal. So anyway, I moved because the opportunities came my way, but also because I didn't fear to go to the unknown spaces. And once I got into Unilever, I remember then the financial controller who was like, you've already been to a financial space, you've been at KPMG, I want you in my team. But I'm like, okay, but I don't even have the qualifications. It's like, you will get it. So he pushed me so hard, and I had to qualify as an accountant in a very short span of time. And I remember at that time I was also a young mother. So I was juggling a new job, which was a trainee program. I'm juggling being a young mom as well as doing this SCCA qualification. So I just threw myself in and, somehow made it through with, I guess, not so much difficulty. Of course, after being in an engineering school, it was a lot easier. And then, I quickly realized that, the finance world was great. I had mastered most of the things that I needed to. And once I moved into GE, 2 years into GE, I was like, I think I had an engineering degree. Maybe it's a good time to dust it out. And that's when I moved into, sales and commercial roles in technology. And that's really when I can say my journey in the energy space began. And as I spent a lot of years in GE, I was building power plants across Africa. And my mother, still in the same village that I grew up in, still had no power. Wow. And so personally, it became a mission to say, hey, I cannot be building power plants for others and my mother is in the dark.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. But just to follow on that, so where do you think that risk-taking mindset came from?
I think really just, growing up, there was a lot of resilience. Growing up in rural Kenya, let me just walk you through a day in my life. We would wake up and first thing you do is, if you're not milking the cows, you're running to the river to get water or you're making breakfast for everybody. So everyone in the morning had chores. My mother was a school teacher. So we were all needed to get done, prepared to go to school. On the way to school, would carry the milk to the dairy, if you like. So drop it and then head to class. At lunchtime, we would come home for lunch. So you go pick the milk tins from the dairy. On your way home, you use it to carry water for the calves because we had lots of cattle. As you walk up, some of you, we were quite a number of us. Some of my siblings, some would be collecting firewood on your way because we were coming to cook lunch. Many times we would not have someone helping, so we would all come, spread out the duties. Some are running to the river, some are cooking lunch, whatever, and that is in a span of 1 hour. Lunch ready, eat, back to school.
Wow.
And in the evening, come back home. There would be things to do, chores to do. I remember there's a time when we had pyrethrum. So we'd be picking pyrethrum, would be doing something in the farm before dark. And then you come back, you're doing dinner, you're doing homework, and then you're going to sleep. So somehow we just learned to build resilience and to be responsible for, ourselves. And I guess that growing up then built an element of realizing that everything was possible. Yeah.
I love that
Yeah.
because I think it's a real reminder
Yeah.
that you never know what your edge is.
Yeah.
And I think it's beautiful because that background that majority of people would say was difficult,
Yeah.
right? Gave you that edge to be in the positions and in the rooms that you are
Yeah.
in today.
Yeah.
Yeah. How beautiful. Now, you made history as the first Kenyan woman, and I think I want to emphasize the first Black woman to lead Schneider Electric East Africa, where you're responsible for driving access to electricity, innovation, and inclusive growth. What was the most challenging part about carrying on that responsibility? And how did you rise above it?
When you take on a new role in a company that is global, you feel that you're stepping into very large shoes. So I was taking over from a colleague who was from France, male, and this business had been, fairly young because it was an acquisition, and there were a lot of challenges. And I had been in the business 2 years before I took over, so it was an understanding of the challenges the business was facing. But then I don't think I understood the amount of responsibility once I became the business leader. Because when you're part of the team, it's different from when you're the leader of the team. So balancing the expectations of the group in terms of delivering the numbers, never mind that I took the role in the middle of COVID. And it was, of course, at a time when, we had to scale down the operations. We were working from home. Customers were also, everybody was scared about what was going to happen. And making sure that the teams were safe from just the COVID perspective, while still delivering on the business expectations, were really a lot of challenges on my table. And of course, the first time I was becoming a business leader. So there was a lot of learning curve in just leading. And, when I think about that period, I remember I faced, what typically people would call imposter syndrome, but I like to call it, a challenging growth opportunity.
I like that.
I sort of, at some point, had elements of self-doubt, voices in my head. I had no idea what I needed to do, which levers. It took a bit of time to prioritize. The thing they say, the first 90 days, I think for me, the first 90 days didn't apply. It took me at least 6 months to figure out what I was, to really feel like I now had clarity and direction. And in those 6 months, I did a lot of soul searching. I also did a lot of, seeking support from different people and just immersing myself in the business and building relationships within the organization, but also externally with customers. Yeah.
You know what I love so much about that is that what you're saying is that you leaped and you said
Yeah,
yes to a position without necessarily knowing exactly how you were going to go
yeah,
about it. And it was difficult. And I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves, say yes, and then the universe sort of manifests the support that is required for you to succeed.
you know, I think about life generally. That's how I've lived. I have stepped into spaces that I had no clue, including the role I have now. I have just said, okay, I have the same brain that has capacity to learn, so let's dig it in. And I'm not afraid to fail, because there are times I've taken, positions that may not have been as great. But all of those have contributed to the person that I am and the person that I'm becoming. Yeah.
Carol, I love that. That's why you're such an inspiring role
Yeah.
model, right? And we're in the UAE and we do care about the GCC. And I think we both think that there are incredible opportunities here. You've just recently stepped into a new role as principal for sustainability in Africa. What is the impact that you hope to drive across the African continent through this particular role?
So when you think about, if I think about my next phase of career, I always say that I wanted to be close to sustainability. Something that's very close to my heart is energy access, which is part of the sustainability broadly. At the moment, I've just joined a new business that we are establishing in Africa called Sustainability Business. And this business is basically a business that was created by Schneider to help other companies to build their own sustainability journeys. And so we have been operating in other markets in the US, in Europe, Australia, Pacific, and all these other regions. But we have not looked at Africa as a business opportunity, largely because if you look at the headlines, you will hear that, Africa is only contributing 2 to 3% of emissions. And generally speaking, people do not imagine that Africa could be a business opportunity. However, if you go deeper and look at the companies in Africa, a lot of them are making their net zero commitments. And so when they make these commitments, a lot of them would require support in order to map out the journeys on how they will, reach their net zero. And so that's really what I would be doing in my next role. I'm also learning. So it's, again, another learning opportunity. And I'm really saying, flying the plane as I fix it. So I'm already meeting customers.
You have a history of excelling with that.
Yes. So I'm already meeting customers and, having these initial discussions as I figure out, what is it that we actually do. So I'm doing both at the same time. Yeah.
And I think speaking about energy access, speaking about electrification, and both sharing that we're both in the energy field, the world is shifting fast, where humans connect to machines and machines speak to each other through AI. In the midst of the digital revolution, how do you see AI reshaping the future of electrification in Africa?
Sometimes when we talk AI, talk electricity access, first of all, we're dealing with a population that is, I would say, in the dark, literally. And so we're trying to solve for the basics. The basics meaning we need them to have some light. And sometimes they say, when you put light, you're shedding light on the poverty. There's actually one UN, I forget his name, who quoted to say, we shine the light on poverty. But I think we need to, because only then do we really get to solve the real challenges. So bringing back the point to, AI, and maybe just connecting a little bit with the dynamics of Africa from a demographic perspective, Africa being the youngest continent, we have amazing young people that are all today growing up into the digital space. And there's recent research that was done by in one of the refugee camps that showed that, if you look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have at the base your food, shelter, and clothing. Digital or connectivity has actually been added as a base on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
So bringing that and connecting it to AI means that once you talk digital, you can't talk digital without electricity, because then the phone has to be charged, right? For them to be connected, there has to be internet. And there has to be, then, once you have a basic charged phone with internet connectivity, anything is possible. And you have a young population. So when I think about Africa, I feel like it's a huge opportunity that is untapped. And I know that some corporates are already starting to establish, some of these offices that are development centers to work on different, software topics. But amazingly, Africa is just an untapped opportunity from an AI perspective. And energy access will be an enabler in a big way. Yeah.
But let's also talk. We might say that sort of the digital revolution, and yes, we are dealing with a lot of people who are in complete darkness. Do you ever worry that the regulatory hurdles, the decisions that we make as a continent, as leaders, to ensure that there's energy access, do you feel that that limits in some way our ability to drive increased power demand?
So I think there's a lot of work that's going on in that space, driven by, all sorts of actors. You have the government, you have the utilities, you also have the power developers, you have the off-grid power players, which is an emerging space and massive.
Yeah.
And then you have linked to that a lot of activity around productive use of electricity. And so when you bring all those actors together, I think there's obviously a great opportunity to create a much more enabling environment. Why do we have these people not connected in the first place? It's because it's difficult, it's expensive, they're in remote locations. And potentially the answer to their lack of connection is the off-grid solutions in the name of mini grids and all this. And along with that is the productive use, so that you're truly bringing, electricity as a tool for development. And when you think about the way we've done it in the past, sometimes we've just provided light without really thinking, okay, so how does the light truly make the economic, how does it improve livelihoods? How does it put more money in people's pockets? So until the light is being used to increase economic activity, then it's just shining on the poverty. So for me, when I see that, I think the opportunity lies, and I wouldn't call it a hurdle. I feel like the regulatory opportunity exists for many governments to truly enable the actors in the off-grid sector. Because if you look at even the current, Mission 300, where, we are all aiming to connect 300 million people by 2030 in Africa, which is a bold initiative, it's estimated that 50% of those connections will come from off-grid.
Yeah.
But today, limited regulatory support exists. There's a lot of, red tape. I just came last week from the, Energy Access Investment Forum. And a lot of the developers who are in the off-grid space were attending that event. And one of the biggest pain points they have is just not only on the regulatory perspective, but also complying with the financials requirements. The whole due diligence process, how many hurdles you have to go through to get a dollar out of an investor. And all those things just make it much more difficult to play in this area, in this space, which is already difficult in its own. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what I take away, and I love that you have an optimistic view, is perhaps if all actors, right, that are solving for energy access, if we don't get it right, it becomes a real burden to the continent. And it becomes a real burden to the young people that are looking for opportunities in this digital world. But if we get it right, it is a real opportunity to leapfrog And so I think it's just the muscle of making sure we've got an incredible time and opportunity to essentially change what has currently been going on and really set and forge a new path for the African continent of, into prosperity.
And I totally agree. If you look at the energy access graph from let's say 20 years ago, and look at it geographically, in absolute numbers, if you look at Africa has been just around about 600 million people for the last 20 years without electricity.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It means we are increasing the population at the same pace as we are energizing, which means it's just a constant number that's not being touched, whichever it is. If you look at other regions, other geographies like Asia, they moved, 20 years ago, we were at like 1.3 billion people. Now we are at about 780. Of 780, 600 million is in Africa. 20 years ago, of the 1.3 billion, 600 was in Africa. So what is wrong with Africa? And one of the things we debated and discussed last week, which was really, fascinating, is the role of public sector in providing access even in off-grid locations is critical for access at scale. What we have seen in Africa is this role has been left to private sector. And private sector will not be able to get returns because this is a public good. And so players in the World Bank and all the public sector players have understood the need now to involve and put public money in the off-grid space. And this gives me hope. And I think the whole Mission 300 discussion initiative is, I think, one of the ways to at least reduce that 600. I'd like to see it down to 300, at least in the next 5 years. I truly hope it is possible. And bringing public money into this space will definitely fast track the connections. Because when you're putting private money that's seeking a return, it's not possible to do that at scale. Yeah, because these are the same people that do not have the capacity to pay.
Yeah. And I just hope, and it's wonderful. I'm in this space, but I think it gives me a lot of hope. Mission 300, run by Andrew Huskowitz, who I've known for many, many years, that this is not just a mission. People are putting their lives to ensure that there's energy access, and they're brilliant, intelligent people. So I believe that we can solve this issue, and that many, many Africans, our youth, will have, an opportunity for a much better future than, they possibly could have imagined.
Yeah.
So I think let's get to work. I think we're dealing with a difficult issue, but incredibly hopeful. Now, Carol, all these positions that you have had, I want to understand, how does Carol lead? And do you think you're a good leader?
Do I think I'm a good leader? That's a good question to ask my teams.
I'm asking you.
But I do believe that I have built my leadership muscle over the years. I have been very intentional about, just honing myself as a leader. I've worked with, different support mechanisms. I've worked with leadership coaches. I have been very open to feedback. And just truly knowing that I'm a work in progress. So for me, leadership is a continuous journey. And I wouldn't say that I am a great leader, but I'm building myself into being a great leader.
Yeah. I really like that. We always know, and I think specifically, for emerging markets, that spotting talent, the right talent, really shapes an organization. What do you look for when you're identifying someone with real potential? And how do you know when you have found it?
This is usually a very dynamic question and also exercise. Sometimes you spot talent and you nurture it and it comes out brilliant. Sometimes you think you've spotted talent, but you hit a miss. And so I think being able to differentiate when you actually are progressing and when you hit a miss is probably one of the biggest areas of development that I'm continuously working on. I have made great hires. I look out for attitude. I look out for hunger, somebody who's hungry, and someone who's really willing to learn, almost somebody who has a growth mindset. I think that for me is fundamental in spotting a talent, because then when somebody has a growth mindset, you can always shape them to anything that you want. And sometimes you might see there are people who are very good at interviewing and very convincing, but when they get to the ground, things are different. So that being able to spot that quickly and maybe take decisions is also a continuous process that I'm working on. Yeah.
No, and it's interesting because I think the people who we share in common say, one, you are a great leader.
Okay.
And I think, two, you have a real ability to nurture talent. So it's interesting to hear your perspective, on that. And I think to hear from you that you are still learning, even though on the outside, externally, many people view you as probably one of the best, And so this is me giving you your flowers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, yeah.
So, risk taker, ambitious, solving for energy access, and probably much, much more. What is legacy to Carol?
I've been listening a lot to different issues around legacy. And somebody said, we're gonna die, and in 100 years, nobody will remember us. And they said legacy is a statement that we call or we tell our ego. So that's just besides the point. But I think for me, really being a part of the solution to challenges that I personally have lived. So I have a lived experience of, lacking energy access. And I'll tell you some of the people that a lot of my relatives, friends, neighbors have still the same energy access challenges. So for me, having been in the space, understood, navigated and seen how some of these solutions can be brought to the ground, I just want to be bringing those to people that I know how they are going through what they're going through because I have a lived experience. Yeah.
No, it's a beautiful legacy.
Yeah.
And I think in real harmony with your actions and the spaces that you occupy.
Yeah.
So I really like that because I think it shows intentionality about that vision and that dream.
Yeah.
And you are doing a superb job so far. So we usually have a closing tradition on this podcast. And at Doers, we're all about action and impact. So tell me, how can this community of doers help propel you to the next level?
Ooh, that's an amazing question. I would like to take it off camera.
But I think the authenticity of it, I think will really benefit everybody. So I'm very curious to hear.
When I think about, having been in the energy access space, I've seen that, when you have capacity to deploy capital, then you can make even much more impact. And so I think I would say, I would like to be placed on tables which I can be able to deploy capital.
I like that. Yeah. I like that. No, because we are manifesting, right? And I think a lot of the individuals who have come and spoken on this podcast are capital allocators. And I think you realize what a critical role that is in a place where funding for a lot of things is incredibly scarce.
Correct.
So everybody, so you heard Carol, the next mission is if there's a board position, venture capital and friends who are looking at individuals who are smart, dedicated, Carol, give her a call.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, wonderful.
Thank you.
Carol,
Yeah.
thank you so, so much for coming on Doers Defined. I think one, we share a lot in terms of, sort of history, in terms of the work that we do. And surprisingly, we had never met.
Yeah.
That surprises me a little bit, but heard so many wonderful things about you and the fact that we could share this stage together. And I could amplify a lot of the work that you're doing. I just wish you the absolute best, and we're right behind you.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's been great chatting. I can't even believe that we finished the time allocated.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And looking forward to doing a lot more together
Sure.
as well.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
There's much more to be done.
Yeah.
600 million people to be
600
electrified.
million people. I think that's what we'll leave everybody
Yeah.
with. There's work to get done. And I think we've got the right people
Yeah.
on board
Yeah.
to get it.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.